the tool. So Sina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Let me quickly share my screen. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Great, thanks, Carlos. So a quick introduction. I'm Sina Wartmann. I work for Ricardo Energy and Environment, just as my colleague Dominic Sheldon, who's in this webinar with me today and has supported the preparation of the projection introduction guide. I have by now nearly 20 years of experience with setting up and enhancing systems related to transparency, for example, greenhouse gas inventories, projections, estimating the impacts of emission measures, reporting under the UNFCCC, and also transparency-related negotiations. So what are we talking about today? If my computer lets me change the slide, I will tell you. So I'm very happy to present to you the guide on projections of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. It's a short document which intends to give you an introduction to the topic. So it doesn't take you by the hand and tell you in detail how to do the greenhouse gas projections for your country, but it provides you an overarching understanding of what greenhouse gas projections are, what the steps are in compiling them, what modeling tools are, how you can use them for the compilation, how to choose a tool. And we have some more information in annexes to the guide. So an overview of reporting requirements under the UNFCCC, certain limitations of models that you should keep in mind when choosing and using a model, and also very importantly, a list of typical data per sector which you need for greenhouse gas projections and sources where you can find such data usually. So let's start with what projections actually are before we look into the guide a lot more. So in general, if we talk about a projection as such, this is simply an estimation of how something could evolve in the future. So we're talking about something quantitative here. So how could a value or a set of values evolve in the future? And that could, of course, be greenhouse gas emissions, but also things like population, GDP, or the food demand. So we're just trying to understand what could potentially happen. Now, if we're talking about greenhouse gas projections specifically, we're trying to estimate, for example, a country's future greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And in order to do that, we need to have certain assumptions how the activities which lead to emissions and removals in that country might change over time. So for example, what kind of production technologies will be used, what fuels will be used for power generation, how will the transport demand evolve, how will the food demand and the population evolve. Now that we know what the greenhouse gas projections are, let's ask what do we actually need them for? And there's quite a lot of things that they can help us with. So you will all remember in 2015 compiling an NDC and setting mitigation targets or one target under that NDC. And for that, many of you have actually already used projections. So they can help you setting a greenhouse gas reduction target by helping you to understand how emissions might evolve in the future. They also help you when you already have a target to understand whether you might be able to meet that target, so whether you are on track or you need to take further actions. And they can also help you to understand how certain mitigation measures or a set of measures might impact future greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And of course, if we bring all these things together, mitigation targets, tracking progress, assessing the impacts of mitigation measures, the projections can also help us to develop a long-term emission development strategy. Now, in the guide, we have a step-by-step approach on how to compile greenhouse gas projections using a modeling tool, and I would like to take you through those steps one by one. So the first step is immediately the most complicated one, so we get it over with. And it's most complicated because here we have an iterative approach. So we start by imagining what kind of questions the projections should help us answer. So is the question, will we reach our target? Is the question, what should the target be? Is the question, what impact will our mitigation measures have? And on that basis, we need to imagine what the future might hold. So we need to build one or several scenarios. And the scenarios is basically just a qualitative description of several possible futures. You all know things like business as usual scenario or low emission scenario or moderate economic development scenario. Now, depending on your scenarios and on the questions you would like to answer with your projections, you can select a modeling tool. We will talk about what kind of tools exist a little bit later. And each tool is a little bit different. Each tool needs different data in different format. So once you have selected one or several potential tools, you will also know what kind of data you need to run that tool. Now, when you have identified the data you need, you will need to check whether that data is available or can easily be generated. And you might realize that this data or this level of detail is out of reach for the moment. And this is where the iterative approach comes in. So you might realize that you'll have to start a bit simpler than you had imagined. And that might mean that because you don't have so much data, you will need to use a different tool, which also means that you will have to adapt your scenario. So these three elements go together. Once you have selected your tool, you will go about the actual data collection. And a lot of data, of course, might come from the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory and from national statistics, for example, from projections regarding the GDP or the population, but also things like energy demand or transport demand. Now the step 3 is actually preparing the projections. You are feeding your data and your assumptions into the chosen tool, and you will calculate your greenhouse gas projection. Between step 3 and step 2, we have also an outside activity or a parallel activity. So if we have mitigation actions that we are tracking, then we will need to include information about the implementation progress of these mitigation actions. So for example, how many energy efficient boilers have we installed as part of the data collection, and then they can be considered in the calculation of the projections. That is already the most exciting step, I would say, because afterwards comes everything that is related to cleaning up. Step 4 is our documentation. We want to write down all our data sources, the data, the assumption, the approaches taken, how the tool was run, the results. That is really boring and nobody wants to do it, but we need to do it because if we want to repeat the exercise, if we want to do the projections again with the same model, then having this information will be extremely helpful. And finally, we need to review and update so we can say, okay, what has gone well this time? What has gone less well? What kind of gaps did we have? Where do we want more detailed data? And as we do with the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, we can set up an improvement plan for when we do the projection next time round for all the things that we want to do better next time. So I'll go into the details of particularly the steps relating to the model now. And after that, we're going to look at an example of good practices in countries that we have seen for the various steps. So let's think a little bit about how modeling works. Not everybody is familiar with this from their day-to-day work. The guide also provides a basic understanding of this, and it gives you a simple categorization of models and describes typical examples of models. So if we want to really simplify the modeling process, we start with a scenario. That scenario gives us the modeling parameters, for example, that could be things like the fuel consumption, the demand transport, the population. All of these things will be entered into the modeling tool. And depending on the type of tool we have, we will gain different outputs. For example, an estimation of future greenhouse gas emissions and removals. For example, information on costs of mitigation measures, or for example, a prioritization of mitigation options. We will talk more about this when we talk about different modeling tools. We have different types of models. And again, I want to be very brief here, and I'll barely scratch the surface just to give you a first idea. So for example, we have top-down models, which look at the economy as a whole, looking at, for example, the overall fuel consumption, the overall demands, the overall financial flow. So here we're not looking into the specifics of single mitigation measures or single subsector activities. We're really looking, we're taking a high-level view. Then we have the opposite. We have bottom-up systems where we're very much looking at sectors and at specific technologies, how we produce steel, how we generate power, and so on. Now you will say, actually, what seems most useful is having both. Having, on one hand, the bottom-up view and also having the top-down view. So for example, if I use certain technologies, what kind of impacts will that have for tax revenue or for job creation? And for that reason, we have hybrid approaches where, for example, you first use a bottom-up model and you take the outputs of that, feed them into a top-down model, and then you have both. Finally, we have accounting models, and these are particularly suited to understanding the impacts of single mitigation measures. So what happens there usually is that we can generate a greenhouse gas emission and removal baseline or business as usual, and then can add information on specific mitigation measures and can then understand how this impacts the overall emission trajectory. Now, of course, you will ask, there are so many models. I don't understand them. How can I choose one? There's quite a number of criteria there, and it completely depends on the country's needs, the questions you want to answer, and the specific circumstances. So, of course, we have put here the question on top. So do I want to set a target? Do I want to assess future emissions and so on? What is that? But also we have things like the resources and the expertise a country has available. So some tools are more or less ready to use, and they will not need a lot of preparation and understanding, not much reading of manuals, and others will need weeks or months to understand. The question is, what kind of data do they need? Type of data, level of detail. What is there a license cost, or are they free? What are the hardware necessities? There's models which take 2 weeks to run on 5 computers. There's other models which you can do on your laptop at home. What is the scope? Are all sectors covered? Is it maybe specific to 1 or 2 sectors? For example, does it focus on energy or a follow? What is the time horizon? That is very important also with regards to what you want to do. So do you want to assess maybe the next 3, 4, 5 years, so more short term, or do you want to assess until 2050? Do you want to get information only on what happens in a specific year in the future, or over a long timeline for every year in the future? And finally, the flexibility. There are some tools who need a very high amount of data and level of detail. And if you don't have that, you will not be able to run them. There's others where you can start with simple data, even with gaps. And then if you have better data, they will be able to use that data as well. That is very convenient if you want to start simple and then improve over time, continuing working with the same model. Here you can see a few examples of models. It's not that we specifically suggest using these models instead of others, but it's just models we see very frequently. So for example, we have LEAP that was used quite a lot, particularly for setting NDC targets. LEAP is very convenient because with a few days preparation, you can get the necessary expertise. So it's not too hard to get into. It allows a very detailed modeling of the power sector, and it runs both with very simple data and very, very detailed data. Then we have GACMO, which is Excel-based. You can just download it. It's free. You can install it easily on your computer. There's not much expertise needed. There's a lot of mitigation measures preloaded. So that is ideal if you just want to plug and play and get a first idea what you might be able to achieve. It's not really suited for long-term modeling, but just to get a first idea, it's ideal. We have Prospects Plus, which is a little bit similar to LEAP in that it allows working with simpler data and more complex data. Again, it's a small tool, it's Excel-based, so easily to download and install. Times is a very complex model, which is more bottom-up focused, so you can represent specific technologies in a lot of detail. You will get very detailed results. Times is an optimization model, so you can basically say, if I want to be carbon neutral in 2045. These are my emissions. This is my demand. These are my technologies today. How can I reach that target in the most cost-efficient manner? And then Times can provide you with an answer. It's, however, a very complex tool, which needs a lot of IT resource and a lot of expertise. It's usually run with universities. So this is definitely not something to start with. Finally, the guide also helps you in choosing a model by providing a number of these so-called questions. So for example, if you want to know what is the most cost-effective route to achieve a set target, then an optimization model like Times could be ideal. If you want to know what the future emissions might be, then an accounting model like LEAP or Prospects Plus could be good. If you want to do a very quick assessment of potential mitigation actions, then you could use GACMO. And if you have limited data today, but would like to continue using the same model as you improve over time, then LEAP or Prospect Plus would be good choices. Now, very quickly, because I know that it's already a bit later than expected, our example. So this is not a specific country, but it's a combination of approaches that we have seen in a number of countries that we worked with. So our example country wanted to use projections to set its NDC target, and it wants to cover the gases CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. It doesn't have information on HFCs, PFCs, and SF6, and therefore it excludes those from the NDC target. It has already done a lot of work on mitigation measures because it has sectoral working groups which have agreed lists of mitigation measures at the sectoral level. And the country is currently preparing its second biannual update report, and that provides it with a lot of assumptions on how things might develop in the various sectors in the future. They choose LEAP as a modeling tool simply because they feel they can continue using this over a longer time, and it offers them the flexibility that where they have little data, they can use simple approaches, but where they have more data, more detailed data, they can use more complicated approaches. And we will see on the next slides how they have done that with the various sectors. So for the data collection, much data comes from the most recent national GHG inventory year, which is 2010. So that's, for example, their activity data and the emission factors. And then from the second BUR which is under preparation, there are certain emission drivers, so things that will influence emissions in the future, like the GDP, the population, and the transport demand. And from the same source, we also have very detailed information on the power demand and the power generation capacities, the fuels used, the power generation costs, and so on. Now, in calculating the projections with LEAP, the country takes very different approaches in the various sectors. So for the power sector, there is a lot of detailed information. So it actually does an optimization because LEAP allows doing that. And that means that LEAP calculates the best way to meet your power demand with the data you have on capacities, the fuels, the costs, and the power demand, and also the share of renewable technologies to be used. For the rest of the energy sector, a simple approach was used considering, for example, per capita fuel demand in households and population increase over time. Then in the transport sector, because LEAP is not a transport model, vehicle numbers and kilometers driven were modeled outside of LEAP. This led to an indication of fuel consumption in the future, and then using the fuel consumption model as the model estimated the transport emissions in the future. For the waste sector, the modeling actually happened with sheets from the IPCC guidelines, and then the finalized emission estimates were directly entered into LEAP. So here the modeling happened completely outside, and the same happened for the forestry and land use change sector, where the greenhouse gas emissions were taken from the most recent inventory year, a growth factor was applied, and then the projected emissions were entered directly into LEAP. very briefly the last two steps. The country saved the LEAP files and the Excel calculation files, but it did not document in detail the specific data sources, how things were done in detail. And it is now in 2021 trying to update the projections for the updated NDC and realizing that it's not really clear anymore what was done and finding it actually quite difficult to repeat the same exercise with LEAP. So clearly a future improvement is enhancing the level of detail of the documentation. So I'm sure you will have questions now, but first we have a few questions. And for that purpose, I'm handing over to my colleague, Dominic. Dominic, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So I have just posted in the chat a couple of pieces of information, and also you'll see on screen the same information. So what we're going to use here is a tool called Mentimeter. If you've not used it before, it's an interactive web tool where we can get sort of direct engagement from you live, and then we can visualize that engagement on screen for you, and so you'll all be able to see the responses to the questions that we're posing. So you've got three ways you can access this. There is the QR code on your screen that you can scan with your mobile device, or you can click on the link that's in the chat, or you can also navigate to menti.com, and then there's a code there to input, and it's also on your screen as well, because I'm now sharing the screen. So as you'll see on screen, we've got a simple binary question, a yes or no answer. Has your country prepared greenhouse gas emission projections in the last 5 years? And we've got 5 answers so far saying yes. So what we'd like you to do is navigate to the website, navigate to the survey, following any of the methods I just described, and to provide your answer to this initial question. We only have a handful of questions. It won't take long. This isn't a quiz, and you're not going to be, this isn't sort of a mining exercise. It's simply an opportunity for us to understand what kind of audience we have with us today, and then we can hopefully facilitate an even better discussion with you guys. We're going to try and move through this relatively quickly, though, because we don't have a huge amount of time, and we'd like to have as much time available for the Q&A as possible. Okay, so we've got 7 responses so far to this first question, 8 responses now. As to has your country prepared GHG projections in the last 5 years? So far, all of our respondents to the survey, which isn't all of the participants in the session right now, I don't believe, no, have responded to this. But also, if you don't feel like you're in a position to answer this question, don't worry at all. It's not mandatory. It's simply an opportunity to engage. Okay, so I'm going to move on, but don't worry if you haven't submitted your answer to this. It's not essential, but we're just going to move on to the second question. So the second question is your country planning on preparing GHG projections in the future or preparing them at the moment? And you'll have 3 options that you can select from: preparing them currently, plan to prepare them in the future, or there are no plans currently. So if you've already prepared projections and you think that you will likely prepare further projections in the future, then feel free to select the plan to prepare them in the future. And this is just to understand from our perspective where you are in the process, and therefore how you might be using this guidance that we have now published. So we've got a few responses here. So I think we had 8 responses as a maximum in the last question. So we've got 4 responses so far, and we're showing a good distribution here of different places in the process. And this is why these questions are really interesting to understand from our perspective where you are, but for also amongst yourselves to see where other people are in this process, and to understand that there's really quite a range and a distribution of positions. So we've got 6 responses so far, and the vast majority are planning to prepare them in the future. 1 is currently preparing them, and 1 have no plans currently. So it's great to see that people from different perspectives are coming to this session, because this guidance will be available for whenever you might choose to engage. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a few more seconds, then we're going to move on to the next point, as we'd like to have as much time for questions afterwards. Okay, so I think 6 might be our maximum. So we're going to move on to the next one. So this is now a different entry format, different input format. We're asking for, this is an open text box for you to write whatever you so choose in response to the question that if you have prepared projections in the past or are preparing them now, what are the main challenges you have faced or are facing? And so what we're looking for is just a very brief sentence, a few words. Don't feel the need to go into detail, just a handful of words. This might be data collection exactly on screen. It's the ever-present response because it is so common, but don't feel, just because you see it on screen, don't feel you shouldn't enter it. the relative density of answers is important as well. If everyone's faced data collection, then everyone should submit it, because then that helps us understand that that is a more common issue than others. So we have a couple of examples here. We've got data collection itself, very common answer. We've also got something slightly more specific, indicators and proxy data. So really good point. So establishing exactly the form of the data you're using, and if you don't have data within country yourself, then where could you find alternatives for that data? That's kind of an extension on that data collection point. And then we've got choice of a projection tool. So actually choosing a tool itself, something that, and this is all of these topics are covered by the guidance tool. So hopefully you'll be able to find some information in there and some resources to use. Then we've got the availability of data, and then the implications of key actors. So whether or not you can get to the data, it might exist, but can you get it? Or maybe it doesn't exist at all, and how might you be able to get it? And then in order to access that data, who might you need to involve and how? The next point is interesting. This isn't one that comes up often, building proper scenarios. So it'd be interesting to learn more about this. This might be something we can go into in the Q&A, exactly what issues people are having. But yeah, a scenario is one imagined version of the future. And that can be quite difficult to agree upon as to what that imagined version should look like. The next one is agreement amongst stakeholders on the underlying assumptions, conflict with interests or expectations, with some interests or expectations, I believe. Don't worry if you're writing this on your phone, we all understand autocorrect plays its role, so don't worry at all. Yes, so we got this conflict that we can have with different stakeholders, and it kind of builds into that previous point there about building proper scenarios. Different people might have different versions of what that future might look like. Okay, so this is really, really good. We won't spend too long here, but keep writing. If you're writing, still keep writing, and don't worry if you do get cut off. And then the final one is to coordinate the different public services and the private sector to accomplish a common vision of mitigation options to be considered in the mitigation scenarios. You've got an unlimited list of things you could do to reduce emissions. Which ones are the most relevant? Which ones are the most effective? Which ones should we actually do and should we model? Very common issue there as well. So I think what we've got here is a really interesting range of responses. Often we have some very common ones. Data collection will come up a lot. I think here we've got a really interesting range showing a variety of different perspectives from which you're coming to this session with. So we're going to move on, but that was fantastic. So thank you for those responses, and keep in mind, if you haven't responded, keep thinking about it and think about any questions you might have related to that. So again, a different input format. This is a ranking exercise. So you should see on your screen an option to select your highest priority. And the priority here is in terms of where you would need the most support. And the options there are the different steps of the projection process. So select whichever option you think is your highest priority for support that you would like to, that you would want to receive. So maybe that's scenario building, as somebody in the previous slide explained, or maybe that's the data collection, maybe it's documentation, not knowing exactly how to record all of this information in one place. So this can, and now you're starting to see these options on screen. So this is where it gets a little bit exciting. We might have a little bit of a race to see who the priority is, and so hopefully this gets you engaged, gets some enthusiasm from you, and we should get quite an interesting range of responses. And you'll see this changing on screen in front of you. So I think tool selection was up there to begin with. Scenario building was obviously up there at one point, but data collection is coming out as the highest priority currently in terms of where people would need the most support. And I think the slide previous to this one that explained how data collection is a very broad category, and within that there are many different challenges you might face. And so we have sort of 20 minutes until the end of the session, and so a good amount of time to dig into some of that in terms of more specific questions and how the guidance might be able to help you with those. We've got 5 responses. We might be starting to settle on a hierarchy here. Scenario building is creeping back up onto data collection as well. Again, quite a common balance. Those imagined scenarios and then the data for fulfill them is a very common challenge. Documentation and calculation often come lower down, but there's still challenges that people face. And tool selection, again, we saw that in the last slide. So we know that that's a very common issue as well. And so hopefully as participants, you're seeing yourselves, your own challenges in what's presented on screen in front of you, and you're understanding that these are common across people, and that therefore there is guidance available that should support people in this. Okay, I'm not seeing a huge amount more activity at this stage. Oh, another little another addition there to put data collection slightly further ahead as number 1. But we'll close this off very briefly, so then we have sort of 15 minutes to do question and answer, and then perhaps 5 minutes just to wrap up. but thank you all for participating in that. And in terms of questions, you have the opportunity to write it in the chat if that works for you. We're all keeping an eye out on the chat to see. Or if you want to raise your hands and then we can call on you specifically to ask a question audibly, then that also works too. So yeah, so I'll stop sharing my screen. I think that's all the responses we're going to get, but hopefully that was useful for you as it was for us. I think it's always informative whenever you get that kind of engagement. Okay, so I've stopped sharing the screen now, and feel free to write in the chat or to raise your hand and we can call on you.
I've put my slides back up for you in case there's any specific questions on the slides themselves. While we're waiting for answers, I found it really interesting. As you know, we had the first webinar yesterday, and there the ranking of support issues was exactly the same. So with data collection first, then the scenario building, then the choice of tools, documentation and calculation last. And for us, it was a bit unexpected because we thought that for sure documentation would not be interesting to anyone. But actually, it's very good to see because it's such an important issue, and there are many useful tools, very simple tools also already around. That it's a good issue to look into. And of course, many of you who have been working on greenhouse gas inventories before, you're quite confident with calculation issues, but there's maybe less experience with things like scenarios. I can't see the chat now. Dominic, do we have any questions?
None just yet, but we understand we've held a lot of. Okay, one has just come in. Okay, so among all of these modeling tools, LEAP, GACMO, Prospects Plus, Times, is there a more usual one recommended here by the UNFCCC under the Paris Agreement?
Thanks for that answer. I am not aware of the UNFCCC recommending a specific tool. So, of course, for the purposes of the future reporting of biannual transparency reports, where you would like and at some point will also need to report greenhouse gas emissions projections, unless you're using flexibility in light of your capacities, then you want to know how your emissions and removals will evolve over time. So in that case, an accounting model can be very, very useful. Personally, I have worked a lot with LEAP. And LEAP is useful in the sense that it already integrates emission factors from the IPCC guidelines. However, I don't think that it suits everybody's needs. So I find it really, really difficult to make a recommendation here. But it's maybe a point to start with LEAP and Prospect Plus, and of course, download the guide, take a look at the models suggested there to see what might suit your needs.
I think it's a frustrating response often, because when we often have the same question and then the response is it depends, isn't it? Exactly. which is very frustrating. But as the guidance presents, you've got that cyclical first step where you've got a set of different components of how you might determine the beginning of your process. And so that's something that is often nationally determined. And so as Sina says, depending on your requirement and then your national circumstances, there's a variety of different options, but hopefully the tool will be useful in beginning to guide you through that. Paulo Cornejo has asked, is there some trend about the use of a specific tool or tools?
That is a question I'd like to have answered myself. So we have not seen any data. I really don't have a good answer at this point. We have seen LEAP a lot, but there's other options used as well. Dominic, maybe we had a recent experience of a country requesting us to recommend a tool, and we went through this process of assessing the needs and considering the options, asking the questions. Maybe it's helpful to explain a little bit how that was done and what the various considerations were, unless there's any other questions, of course.
There's not yet, and Paolo has also let us off the hook already. He said you've already answered his question, so that won't stop us. I'm sure we can continue talking. But as Sina says, LEAP is one that comes up very often. So we engaged with a project where, for a specific country, they wanted to begin the process of developing a long-term strategy, but they weren't looking for support with developing the strategy itself. They were looking for support in developing a roadmap on how to, and part of this was to start to evaluate the modeling tools used, what some other countries might have used, what they might use based on their national circumstances. And part of the complexity here is that they had some history with using modeling tools already. They had some experience in the energy sector and the transport sector, specifically using specific tools, but often in different departments of the government or outside of the government. So a range of institutional structures, exposure to these tools, a range of expertise in those institutional structures in order to engage with them. So you then come with the department that's responsible for coordinating the long-term strategy, then has a different set of skills, a different set of knowledge. And so they face this challenge of which one of these tools should we use? The end recommendation was LEAP fundamentally, but then perhaps using a tool like Times to validate the assumptions. But then the recommendation was going, as Sina mentioned earlier, using a university to do that validation process. So it was something that perhaps might be beyond the capacity and the budget of the local department, of the national department itself, but there's something you could use to explore the validation of that. But LEAP is something that comes up often, especially with developing countries around the world. It's free to use for any developing country and is very scalable. So you can start with as basic information as you want and then scale it. You develop the inputs yourself. It's not fixed inputs like GACMO where you're just inputting in the boxes. You're stipulating the inputs, so it's sort of relatively infinite as to how you stipulate those. But yeah, the ones we shared also earlier in the presentation are probably some of the more common. Okay, we've got some more comments coming in, which is excellent. Thank you for suggesting these. So I don't know how to pronounce your name. I think, is it Anayak or but the second question, thank you for engaging with us. So could you explain to me why the documentation comes after the model, please? I think I do not understand, because we are a little used to consulting the documentation before approaching a subject, and on modeling it is a question of looking for the most robust models possible according to the available data. Thank you so much.
I see. I think this is an issue of terminology. So when we say documentation, we mean writing down things. So making a list of all the data you have used, of all of the data sources, all of your assumptions, your emission factors, and so on. But documentation, particularly with regards to IT tools, can simply mean the manuals, the guidance for using those tools. And obviously, you're absolutely right in saying, if I want to use a tool, I will look at the manual before to understand what I need, to understand how it works. So that doesn't make a lot of sense afterwards. What we are really saying is basically noting all the relevant information and all the relevant approaches used. So when you want to repeat it again, you can do that. I hope, has that been helpful?
I think so. Please do follow up if you would like any more information, and and engage with us ongoing. So we've got a comment from Ricardo Delgado, which I think is really important and feeds exactly into the conversation we were just having. So he says that I think it's important to highlight that even the simpler tools such as LEAP would need quite an effort when modeling mitigation scenarios, because the mitigation options would need to come from the modeler's knowledge. The model does not select or propose any mitigation action. So the times model, on the other hand, is harder to calibrate and set up, but makes an important contribution when selecting appropriate mitigation actions, because it provides information on plausible actions facing emissions constraints. So I think that's something that we were just talking about ourselves, that in format it might be simpler, but that doesn't mean it's easier. It requires certain specific knowledge. Sina, do you have any reactions to that?
Yes, and I absolutely agree. I mean, with mitigation actions, if you want to quantify the impacts, it's all about your assumptions, because what you are doing is you are comparing two situations. You're comparing the situations without your mitigation actions and with your mitigation actions. And a million different assumptions will go into that. For example, specific technologies, costs, people's behavior, developments that have actually nothing to do with the mitigation measure itself, which can, however, influence certain demands. So if you want to model a mitigation action well, you need to get a lot of stakeholders around the table. And you have already said how difficult that can be to get them together and to get to agree on a vision or how a scenario might evolve. And the moment you change a few assumptions, your results can be very, very different. So you need a certain level of confidence to do that in a model. So on one hand, on a technical level, it's not that difficult maybe to find data and to enter it into a model like LEAP, but to make the right choices and to consult the right stakeholders, that is very, very difficult. And I agree that here times will help more than LEAP does. But still, I mean, the issue of stakeholder consultation remains. And we come back, let me go back to the slide here. That obviously I have skipped, sorry. So you have a scenario and you extract the modeling parameters, which you put into the tool. So if you don't do your scenario building properly, and if you don't extract the right parameters in the right manner, your modeling will not be useful. You can still have a result, but it might not be meaningful. So you should never underestimate the importance of the scenario building step and the extracting of the modeling parameters. So this is really not so much a technical issue, but I would say a stakeholder consultation issue, an issue of interacting and agreeing.
And then we've got a question that's really pertinent from Paolo as well. So he's asked, do you know if some developed country is providing technical support or capacity building to developing countries on this matter? And I take this matter as sort of general GHG projections. I can give an initial reaction based on my experience, and then Sina can give hers. So I know that recently, just this year, on updated NDCs, I know that UNEP have supported some works, especially the Stockholm Environment Institute, who are the owner of LEAP, for instance, with their model, in delivering some direct capacity building and support, and also literally funding the development of projections by SEI, as well as GIZ, and several times under the Climate Action Enhancement Package of the NDC partnership. I've seen projects along those lines. Sina, what's your response?
Yeah, there was quite a lot of activity from the UNDP's Global Support Program on projections. So there were various trainings on LEAP, for example. I know that the current GSP phase has ended, and everyone's waiting for the next phase to begin. And I don't know what that holds, but I know that this issue was very important. So I could assume that there will be more activity. And maybe the colleagues from PATPA could comment on this more, with regards to the GSP and also with regards to support activities in general.
Yeah, thanks, Sina. Maybe I can come in and comment on that. So basically at PATPA, we provide firstly this kind of support. I mean, if this, I think this can also be considered some sort of support, but I think Paulo's question is going more at sort of bilateral trainings and so on. What PATPA does offer is through the climate help desk, the so-called climate help desk. PATPA does work with countries bilaterally on a case-to-case basis, and that's usually it's targeted, limited support, so it has also a cap on the amount of support, but countries can easily apply to that and then basically explain where exactly they would need support for a particular transparency related issue, in this case for projection development. And then that request is jointly analyzed with the Ministry of Environment, the German Ministry of Environment, and then a decision is made and an activity is built upon that request. So that's also an option. Regarding the GSP, unfortunately, I cannot comment on that. I do not have the latest information outside that there will be a next phase. We just do not know, when the exact start date will be.
I think just to add to this very briefly before we any other comments and then we wrap up. Also, I think as this is becoming more and more common, there's more freely available information out there on the internet. For instance, the guidance we've produced and are launching today, but also, for instance, with the model LEAP, we're not recommending LEAP specifically. It's just a LEAP model that comes up very often, and therefore there's a lot of information surrounding it. The Stockholm Environment Institute now put out their own tutorial videos on YouTube, so you can go and familiarize yourself with that as a model if that's useful, and so that would help perhaps with the calculation step. But fundamentally, there are still all of the other steps of the projections process that you might need support on, and the support programs that we've explained might be useful for that. Ricardo says, thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and I foresee that we'll use the report in our country. It's a useful document. Congratulations. That's excellent feedback. Thank you. Sina, is there anything else you wanted to say on that point before I hand over to Carlos to wrap us up?
Thank you very much. No, I just wanted to go back to the slide you're just seeing and say that, of course, the slides will be circulated after the event, and in the slides you can find a direct link to the document so you can easily download it. Thanks. And I think with that we can hand back over to Carlos.
Thank you very much, Sina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm never sure when I share my screen. Thank you very much. Yes, so this is a point where we start wrapping up. We hope that was very interesting for you, and that hopefully this will already, if you have not seen the tool yet, then this will motivate you to take a look at the tool after this event. But I also wanted to close this today's webinar with also some announcements, because as I said at the beginning of this session, we will be releasing more knowledge products, more documents throughout the year. And I just wanted to show you briefly some of the ones that will be released in the coming months. Some of them will be update to existing tools. For example, the accounting tool, that's an accounting tool that was developed right before actually the agreement of the accounting rules were finished in Poland, in Katowice in 2018. So this update includes all the changes that were finally introduced after those decisions. And it includes mostly a section on the development of BAU, on the accounting of BAU and deviation targets. So it's quite interesting to take a look at that once it's released. Another update is the update to the BUR template. It's basically a simplified version of the one already existing in order to support countries that have not yet presented any BURs or that have presented only one. Of course, our recommendation is always start thinking on the BTR already, but for those countries that are looking for a template for the last BUR that they will present, this can be very useful as the start. And lastly, the other update is it's a good practice study on GHG inventory for the waste sector. There's already that study already exists and was published several years ago, and now we thought it was a good time to do an update to that. And regarding new knowledge products, there's a knowledge product coming quite soon, the so-called BTR roadmap and guidance tool, and that document basically is an Excel-based it's an Excel-based tool that guides the user through the different steps of the process for reaching basically the deadline to submit their first BTR, and it walks you through different steps where users will have to choose or answer different questions by choosing in drop-down menus the option that best represents their national circumstances. The tool then calculates all those replies, and in the end, it provides the user with a indicative roadmap of how much time they would need to implement each of the activities, including in a separate kind of bar the capacity building time associated to that tool, so that countries have a better idea and prepare themselves better for the first BTR. And lastly, there's another knowledge product in the making. That's a knowledge product focused at. It's also basically a basic guidance for countries to have an idea of how to choose the best suited indicators for them for tracking their NDCs. This is also something that, as countries are implementing their NDCs, this is something that practitioners should start thinking right now, and not at the end, not when there's only 1 month left to submit the BTR. So hopefully this will also be a relevant tool for all of you when the time comes to start thinking on the best indicators to track your respective NDCs. So yes, that's very exciting news, at least for me. I hope for you as well. So the message in the end is stay tuned. There will be news coming in. Marta also, just before I forget, Marta also posted in the chat that there's translations coming as well for this particular document, for the one on projections. So that's also something that we will communicate to you when the time comes. To French, Portuguese, and Spanish will be the translations. And yeah, without anything else, I would just like to thank you once again. Remind you that if you want to revise this presentation, it's recorded, so it will be also uploaded to the website. And I really hope that we have the chance to exchange with you in the near future. So thank you very much also to our great presenters and to our technical team. And have a lively evening or afternoon wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.